On a luxurious farm, a magnificent brown horse is brutally forced to compete by his millionaire owner. When the horse loses the race, the man explodes in fury and chases him with an axe to terrify him as punishment. Panicked, the animal tries to leap a barbed wire fence to escape, but ends up tangled in the sharp wires. The farmer looks coldly at the suffering animal and declares cruelly, "This is the fate you deserve. No one will ever get you out of here." That's when a 60-year-old beggar, wandering along dusty roads, finds the horse trapped in the fence. But there's something about this old man no one can imagine. Something that ties his dark past directly to the cruel farmer. What he does to save the horse will spark an epic battle against injustice in a journey that will change both lives forever. The morning mist still clung to the fields when the sound echoed down the dirt road. Hooves galloped in a frantic panic, each beat against the ground resonating like war drums in the pre-dawn silence. Jedediah froze abruptly, his calloused hands tightening around the handle of the rusty hoe he carried like a cane, and raised his tired eyes towards the noise. At 60, his stooped shoulders, bowed by a lifetime of hardship, told stories his lips never would. The patched clothes hanging from his gaunt frame were all that remained of a once dignified existence. His bare feet, hardened by hot asphalt and cold earth, knew every stone of that road he walked daily, searching for temporary work, a scrap of food, a flicker of compassion. The sound intensified. It was pure terror translated into motion, and Jedediah recognized it immediately. 40 years tending animals had taught him the difference between a gallop of joy and a gallop of desperation. This was the latter, and something in his chest constricted with painful familiarity. Through the mist, a white shadow emerged like a materialized phantom. The horse appeared at the bend in the road, its pale coat gleaming even in the dim pre-dawn light, its mane streaming like tattered banners of surrender, its eyes, wide with terror, reflected a primal fear that made Jedediah's throat tighten. Behind the animal, a human figure appeared. Jedediah didn't need to see the face to recognize the robust silhouette of Colonel Sterling Hayes, the wealthiest rancher in the county. The man wielded something in his hands, and the metallic glint that caught the morning light made Jedediah's stomach churn. It was an axe, not raised to strike, but brandished as an instrument of intimidation, a threat that sent the poor animal running in absolute desperation. "Worthless beast," Colonel Hayes's voice sliced through the morning air like a blade. "Lost the race and now you want to defy me? I'll teach you who's in charge here." The horse, in its desperate flight, spotted the barbed wire fence separating the road from the neighboring property. Out of options, the animal attempted the impossible jump. Jedediah watched, helpless, as its hind hooves tangled in the cutting wires. The whinny of pain that echoed across the fields was like a dagger to his soul. The colonel stopped abruptly at the sight of his prize caught in the fence, panting with rage and exertion. For a moment, his eyes met Jedediah's across the distance. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. The rancher bared a cruel smile, as if the drifter's presence added a special spice to his morning. "Well, look who decided to show his face," Hayes muttered, loud enough for Jedediah to hear. "The great thief, witnessing the discipline of a real animal. Maybe you'll learn something." Jedediah lowered his gaze, but not out of humiliation. It was a survival strategy harshly learned over the past 5 years. Don't provoke, don't challenge, don't give reason to make an already difficult life utterly unbearable. But when he raised his eyes again, they went straight to the horse caught in the fence. The animal watched him with an intensity that transcended the moment. There was something in those dark eyes, a silent plea that touched a deep chord in his memory. Jedediah knew that look. He knew that horse. It was Tempest, the colt he himself had helped deliver 15 years ago, when he was still an exemplary stable hand at the Sterling Hayes ranch. The same animal that used to calm only at the sound of his voice, that would eat sugar from his hands and rest its head on his shoulder on warm afternoons. The colonel turned on his heel and left, leaving behind only the dust kicked up by his boots and the implicit promise that he would return to deal with the horse. Jedediah remained motionless until the sound of footsteps faded into the distance, then slowly began to walk towards the fence. Tempest watched him approach, and for an instant, 15 years of separation vanished. The horse made a low sound, almost a murmur that sounded like recognition. Jedediah extended his trembling hand, and when his fingers touched the soft muzzle, he knew his life was about to change again. This time, however, he wouldn't run. The touch of the soft muzzle against his palm unleashed a torrent of memories Jedediah had tried to bury for 5 long years. His fingers trembled as he delicately stroked Tempest's face, and for a moment, he was no longer the outcast drifter, but the Jedediah of before, the respected man, the exemplary employee, the one everyone trusted. "I know, old friend," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I haven't forgotten either." The barbed wire had cut deep into the horse's hind legs, and small drops of blood stained the dry earth. Jedediah examined the wounds with the experience of a man who had dedicated his entire life to animal care. Nothing fatal, but painful enough to keep Tempest immobilized and vulnerable. As his experienced hands assessed the damage, his mind drifted back to that terrible night 5 years ago. It had been a rainy Friday when Colonel Sterling Hayes had called him into the ranch office. Jedediah still remembered the smell of leather and tobacco that permeated the room, the shelves filled with trophies from champion horses, many of them animals he himself had trained and cared for. "Jedediah," the colonel had said without looking up from the papers scattered across the mahogany desk, "I've discovered some irregularities in the accounting over the past few months. Money missing, feed being diverted, equipment disappearing." Jedediah's heart had leaped into his chest, not from guilt, but from genuine concern. As foreman of the stables, he was responsible for overseeing everything related to the animals. If there were administrative issues, he wanted to help resolve them. "That won't be necessary." The rancher's voice had cut off his words like a blade. "I've already found the culprit." It was then that Hayes had raised his eyes, and Jedediah saw something he would never forget. A cold, calculating gleam that didn't fit the situation. It wasn't the expression of someone who had uncovered a crime, but of someone who had just created one. "You, Jedediah. You're the one who stole from me." The accusation had fallen on him like a bolt from the blue. Documents were presented, doctored invoices, forged receipts, sales records he'd never made. Everything looked real. Everything pointed to him. And Jedediah understood with growing horror that he had been meticulously framed. "Colonel, I would never. You've known me for 15 years. I cared for your horses as if they were my own children. And that's precisely how you managed to deceive me for so long," Hayes had retorted, rising from his chair with rehearsed theatricality. "Misplaced trust. Jedediah, my mistake was believing in you." Now, 5 years later, kneeling beside Tempest caught in the fence, Jedediah finally understood what had truly happened that night. The colonel hadn't uncovered a culprit. He had created a scapegoat to cover up his own administrative incompetence. The ranch's business had been struggling for months. Excessive spending and bad investments had led to losses, and someone needed to take the fall. Jedediah had been the perfect choice, a loyal employee too trusting to adequately defend himself, too respected for anyone to question the accusations, and too poor to hire a competent lawyer. The sound of footsteps on the dirt road brought him back to the present. A woman approached, carrying a wicker basket and observing the scene before her with curiosity. Jedediah recognized her immediately. It was Mrs. Gable, owner of the small general store in town, one of the few people who still occasionally spoke to him. "Jedediah, what happened to this horse?" He stood up slowly, wiping his blood-stained hands on his torn shirt. "Got tangled in the wire, Mrs. Gable. He's hurt, but it's not severe." The woman approached, frowning when she recognized the animal. "Isn't this Colonel Hayes's champion horse, the one that won the Derby last year?" "That's him. Tempest." Mrs. Gable looked at him with an intrigued expression. "You know this horse?" For a moment, Jedediah hesitated. Talking about the past meant opening wounds he preferred to keep closed, but something in the way Tempest watched him, confident and expectant, made him decide on the truth. "I helped this horse come into the world, Mrs. Gable. I cared for him during his first few years, before everything happened." Understanding slowly dawned on the woman's face. She knew the story, as everyone in the county did. The difference was that, unlike most, Mrs. Gable had always had her doubts about the official version of events. "And now, what will you do?" Jedediah looked at Tempest, then at his own calloused hands. The answer left his lips before his conscious mind had fully formulated it. "I'm going to take care of him. I can't do much, but I can try to ease his pain." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, then opened her basket and pulled out a piece of bread and a small bottle of water. "Here, you'll need your strength." When she left, leaving Jedediah alone with Tempest again, the man knew he had just crossed an invisible line. There was no more pretending he didn't see, didn't care, that he could simply move on. Colonel Sterling Hayes had destroyed his life once. Now, by deciding to help Tempest, Jedediah knew he was putting himself back in the crosshairs of the most powerful man in the county, but this time he wasn't willing to retreat without a fight. The crescent moon faintly illuminated the road when Jedediah returned on the first night. He had spent the entire day thinking about Tempest, imagining the animal alone and wounded, caught in that cruel wire. During his walk searching for work, his thoughts constantly returned to those eyes that had recognized him, to that muzzle that sought his touch with the trust of bygone days. He carried a plastic bottle of water he'd managed to fill at a public spigot and a few handfuls of grass he'd gathered discreetly throughout the day. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. His bare feet knew every stone of that road, and he moved silently through the darkness, guided by memory and determination. When he arrived at the spot, Tempest immediately raised his head. The horse had spent the entire day in that uncomfortable position, its hind legs still tangled in the barbed wire, but its eyes gleamed at the recognition of the familiar silhouette approaching. "Easy, old friend," Jedediah whispered, his voice low so as not to draw attention. "I came to take care of you." He approached slowly, letting Tempest scent his presence before extending his hand. The horse nudged its muzzle into his palm, and Jedediah felt a wave of emotion that nearly knocked him off his feet. It was as if 15 years of separation dissolved in that simple gesture of trust. His calloused hands began to carefully examine the wire binding the animal's legs. The metal was intricately woven, and every movement had to be calculated not to cause further injury. Jedediah worked patiently, whispering words of comfort as his fingers bled from the cuts of the sharp strands. "Remember when you were little," he murmured, carefully loosening one of the wires. "You couldn't sleep on stormy nights. I'd stay in the stable with you, singing those old songs my mama taught me." Tempest remained motionless, as if understanding that every movement could worsen its situation. There was a dignified patience in the animal, a mutual understanding between it and the man working to free it. The process was slow and painful. With each strand he managed to loosen, Jedediah discovered another deeper tangle. His back ached from the bent position, his knees protested against the hard ground, but he kept working. There was something almost meditative about the nocturnal ritual. Just him, the horse, and the silent moon witnessing his effort. "You know, Tempest," he continued, talking more to calm himself than the animal, "I used to dream that one day I'd have my own farm, small but mine, where I could care for animals the right way, with respect and kindness." He managed to loosen one of the main strands, and Tempest slightly moved its leg, testing its partial freedom. The relief in the animal's gaze was like a gift to Jedediah. He then offered the water he'd brought, pouring it carefully into his cupped hand. Tempest drank eagerly, its rough tongue licking every precious drop. Afterward, Jedediah presented the grass he had gathered, watching with satisfaction as the horse slowly chewed, savoring each fiber. "Tomorrow I'll try to bring something better," he promised, stroking the animal's neck. "Maybe I can get some stale carrots from the market." It was then he heard the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights cut through the darkness of the road, and Jedediah felt his heart quicken. Quickly, he gathered the empty bottle and backed away from the fence, hiding behind a nearby tree. The vehicle passed slowly, and by its headlights, Jedediah recognized Colonel Sterling Hayes's pickup truck. The rancher was making his nightly rounds, checking on his properties. For a terrible moment, Jedediah thought he'd be discovered, but the truck continued its way, disappearing around the next bend. When he returned to Tempest, the horse watched him with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding. It was as if the animal knew Jedediah was risking everything to help it. "Don't worry," Jedediah whispered, returning to work on the wires. "I won't give up on you. Not ever again." He managed to loosen a few more strands before fatigue overcame him. His hands were bleeding more intensely now, and he knew he needed to stop before he lost too much strength. But the progress was visible. Tempest now had much more mobility in one of its hind legs. "Tomorrow night I'll be back," he promised, softly kissing the animal's muzzle. "And we'll keep going until you're free." He began to pull away, but stopped when he heard a low sound from Tempest. It was almost like a murmur of gratitude, a recognition of the dedication it was receiving. Jedediah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in months. As he walked back down the dark road, heading for the small, makeshift shelter beneath a highway overpass where he spent his nights, Jedediah felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. He had found a reason to wake each morning, a mission that gave meaning to his empty days. He didn't know yet that his silent dedication was being watched by eyes he preferred to avoid, nor did he imagine that, in Colonel Sterling Hayes's mansion, plans were being laid to turn his compassion into his greatest nightmare. In the darkness of the night, only the moon bore witness to the birth of a loyalty that would defy all the cruelty in the world. But some secrets, however well kept, have the power to reveal themselves at the most perilous moment. The second night brought rain. Jedediah walked along the muddy road, his bare feet slipping in the puddles that formed between the stones. The cold water seeped into his already worn clothes, but none of it mattered. Tempest was waiting, and a promise made to an injured animal was worth more than his own comfort. When he reached the fence, he found the horse visibly forlorn. The rain had turned the spot into a muddy mess, and Tempest trembled from both the cold and the pain of wounds that couldn't heal properly in the constant dampness. "My God," Jedediah murmured, seeing the animal's state. "This can't go on." He pulled off his own shirt, the only dry piece of clothing he still possessed, and began to carefully dry Tempest's body. The horse leaned into the touch, seeking human warmth as if it were its only salvation on that cold, miserable night. It was then Jedediah noticed they weren't alone. A small figure moved in the nearby shadows, watching them silently. For a moment, panic seized him. Could it be someone sent by the colonel? But as the figure drew closer, he recognized the young face of Marina, Mrs. Gable's daughter. The 22-year-old was known throughout the county for her uncommon resolve. She had studied veterinary medicine in the state capital and had recently returned to help local breeders. Her dark eyes shone with intelligence and compassion, qualities that made her respected despite her youth. "Jedediah," her voice was low, almost a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He stared at her in silence for a moment, evaluating if he could trust the young woman. There was something in her gaze that conveyed reassurance, a sincerity that starkly contrasted with the falsehood that dominated the county. "Caring for him," he replied simply, continuing to dry Tempest. Marina stepped closer, and Jedediah could see she carried a small bag. "My mother told me about you too, about what happened yesterday morning." "And what exactly did your mother say?" "That a good man was trying to help an animal that didn't deserve to suffer." Marina knelt beside Jedediah, professionally examining Tempest's wounds. "I brought some things that might help." From the bag, she pulled out an antiseptic, some bandages, and pain medication. Jedediah watched her work with precise, gentle movements, her hands small but steady as she treated the cuts caused by the barbed wire. "Why are you doing this?" Jedediah asked, genuinely puzzled. "Helping a drifter and a horse that isn't even yours." Marina paused her work for a moment and looked directly at him. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I also have my doubts about what really happened to you 5 years ago." The confession caught him off guard. "Your doubts?" "My father was an accountant, Jedediah. Before he passed, he worked with several ranches in the county, including Colonel Sterling Hayes. He always told me that numbers have a way of telling tales people want to keep buried." She returned to treating Tempest's wounds, but continued speaking. "In the months leading up to your departure from the ranch, my father mentioned several times about irregularities in the Colonel's expenditures, bad investments, unnecessary purchases, accumulating debts." Jedediah felt his heart quicken, and after I left, magically, the financial problems resolved themselves, as if someone had found a convenient scapegoat for all the previous losses. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Marina finished treating Tempest and stood up, wiping her hands on a cloth she'd brought. "I can't prove anything," she admitted. "My father died a few months later, and all the documents he kept mysteriously vanished from his office." "And why are you telling me this now?" Marina smiled sadly. "Dorsis, because seeing you here, caring for this horse, even knowing the risks you're taking, reminds me of who you really are. The Jedediah I knew as a child would never steal anything from anyone." She prepared to leave, but Jedediah stopped her with a question that tormented him. "Marina, does the Colonel know you're here?" "Not yet, but he will. Eventually. Colonel Sterling Hayes has eyes and ears all over this county." She paused, weighing her next words. "Actually, there's something else you need to know." Jedediah waited, sensing that what came next would change everything. "Yesterday afternoon, the Colonel went to my mother's general store. He asked a lot of questions about you, where you've been sleeping, if anyone's offered you work, if you've been seen around here often." Jedediah's blood ran cold. "And what did your mother say?" "That she didn't know anything." "But he didn't seem convinced." Marina gently touched his arm. "Jedediah, whatever your plan is to help Tempest, you need to be very careful. The Colonel is suspicious." After Marina left, Jedediah stayed with Tempest a while longer, but his mind was racing. If the Colonel was already investigating his presence in the county, how long would it take him to discover his nightly visits to the horse? As he worked to loosen more strands of wire, a new concern grew in his chest. What if his attempt to help Tempest ended up putting others in danger? Marina and Mrs. Gable had already shown him kindness, and in the world controlled by Colonel Sterling Hayes, kindness could be severely punished. When he finally said goodbye to Tempest that night, Jedediah carried a somber certainty. Time was running out. Soon, very soon, he would be forced to make a decision that would define not only the horse's fate, but the course of his own life, and deep in his heart, he knew he had already made his choice. The dawn of the third morning brought with it a discovery that made Jedediah's stomach churn. When he approached the fence where Tempest remained trapped, he found something that hadn't been there the night before, a small security camera discreetly installed on a nearby post, its lens aimed precisely at the spot where the horse was located. Jedediah stopped abruptly, pretending merely to be passing by on the road. His heart hammered in his chest as he observed the camera out of the corner of his eye. It was small and modern, clearly installed during the early morning hours. Colonel Sterling Hayes had decided to find out who was interfering with his property. Tempest saw him approach and whinnied softly, a sound that mixed hope and desperation. The animal had waited for him all night, and now Jedediah needed to pretend he didn't know it, that he was just a drifter, casually passing by on the road. "Sorry, old friend," he muttered through gritted teeth, too low for any microphone to pick up. "I'll have to find another way." He continued walking down the road, but every step that took him further from Tempest was like a stab. The horse tried to follow him with its gaze, and Jedediah could see the confusion and sadness in the animal's dark eyes. It was like abandoning a child. For the rest of the day, Jedediah wandered the county, trying to think of a solution. The camera made any direct approach impossible, but he knew those lands better than any security system. He had worked there for 15 years, knew every trail, every fence, every alternative path. It was mid-afternoon when he found Marina in the town square. The young veterinarian was talking with some local breeders when she saw him approach. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she immediately understood that something had changed. "Excuse me," she said to the other men. "I need to check something at the vet supply store." Jedediah discreetly followed her to the small store where she bought her supplies. When they were alone among the shelves of medication, Marina turned to him, concern etched on her face. "What happened?" "Cameras," Jedediah said simply. He put up cameras. Marina closed her eyes for a moment, as if she had expected this. "I knew this would happen. The colonel isn't an idiot. If someone was caring for the horse, he was going to find a way to catch them. I can't get close to him during the day anymore. And at night." Jedediah shook his head. "It's too risky." "And Tempest? How is he?" The pain in Jedediah's voice was evident. "Worsening. The wounds aren't healing. And he's getting weaker. He needs constant care, not just these sporadic visits." Marina was silent for a few moments, clearly thinking. When she spoke again, her voice carried a determination Jedediah recognized as very much like his own. "I'm going to talk to the colonel." "Marina, no!" Jedediah's response was immediate and desperate. "You don't understand how dangerous he is. He could ruin your career, ruin your life here in the county. And you don't understand that I can't just stand by and watch an animal suffer when I have the knowledge to help him." Her eyes gleamed with resolve. "I'm a vet, Jedediah. It's my duty. But I'll make up some excuse. I'll say I was just passing by on the road and saw the injured horse. I'll offer my professional services." Marina gently touched his arm. "We won't be able to save him with just nightly visits. He needs proper medical treatment." Jedediah knew she was right, but worry consumed him. "What if the colonel gets suspicious? What if he realizes you know about me? Then we'll face that problem when it comes up." Marina smiled, but there was nervousness behind her bravado. "For now, let's focus on saving Tempest." They parted with a simple plan. Marina would seek out Colonel Sterling Hayes that very afternoon, offering her veterinary services to treat the injured horse. Jedediah would remain away from the area for a few days, allowing time for any suspicion about his presence to dissipate. But as the hours passed, Jedediah felt a growing unease. There was something about the whole scenario that didn't quite fit. Why had the colonel left Tempest trapped in the fence for so long? Why hadn't he called a vet immediately? The answer came to him like a bolt from the blue. It was a trap. From the beginning, everything had been an elaborate snare. The colonel knew Jedediah was still in the county. He knew the man who had once cared for Tempest couldn't resist helping the injured animal. The entire scene, the trapped horse, the wounds, even the delay in seeking professional help was a carefully orchestrated plan to lure Jedediah and give the colonel another chance to utterly destroy him. And now Marina was walking directly into the center of this web of lies and manipulation. Jedediah began to run towards the Sterling Hayes ranch, his bare feet desperately slapping against the hot asphalt. He needed to get there before it was too late, before another innocent person was dragged into the cruel game Colonel Sterling Hayes played with human lives. But as he ran, a terrible question echoed in his mind. What if it was already too late? What if Marina was already face to face with the man who had turned manipulation into an art and cruelty into a science? The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky blood red, and Jedediah ran against time, knowing that every lost second could mean the destruction of another innocent life. Jedediah reached the gates of the Sterling Hayes Ranch as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in orange hues that seemed like harbingers of a storm. His legs trembled from the effort of running, his lungs burned, but the adrenaline of desperation kept him moving. Marina's car was parked at the entrance. She was already inside, face to face with the colonel. Through the lit windows of the main house, Jedediah could see silhouettes moving in the living room. He immediately recognized the imposing figure of Colonel Sterling Hayes, gesticulating broadly as he spoke. Marina was seated in an armchair, her rigid posture betraying the tension of the moment. Jedediah hid behind a nearby fence, trying to decide what to do. Going through the front door would be suicide. The colonel would have him arrested immediately for trespassing. But he couldn't just stand there and watch while Marina put herself in danger because of him. It was then he heard voices coming from the side porch of the house. The colonel had come out with Marina, likely to show her where Tempest was trapped. Jedediah moved silently among the trees, getting close enough to overhear the conversation without being seen. "It's truly a regrettable situation," the colonel was saying, his voice laden with theatrical concern. "My poor Tempest caught in that fence for 3 days now. I was just about to call a vet, but how fortunate that you happened to show up." 3 days. Marina's voice carried barely disguised disbelief. "Colonel, with all due respect, this animal needed urgent medical attention. 3 days is far too long to leave any wound exposed." There was a pause, and Jedediah noticed the colonel had stopped walking. When the man spoke again, his voice had lost all its feigned cordiality. "Dr. Marina, are you implying that I don't properly care for my animals?" "I'm not implying anything, Colonel. I'm stating a veterinary medical fact." Jedediah felt a chill run down his spine. Marina was challenging the colonel directly, and that was precisely the kind of behavior the man would not tolerate. He needed to intervene before the situation spun completely out of control. "Interesting," the colonel murmured. "Very interesting indeed. You know, Doctor, there have been some curious things happening around here lately. Someone has been visiting my horse during the nights. Someone has been caring for him." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Marina had understood she'd fallen into a trap, but her voice remained firm when she replied, "If someone was caring for the animal, you should be grateful, not investigating." "Ah, but I know very well who that someone is." The colonel laughed, a cold and unpleasant sound. "It's my old friend Jedediah, the thief I fired 5 years ago. He's come back to finish what he started." "Jedediah is no thief." The words tumbled from Marina's mouth before she could stop herself. It was at that moment Jedediah knew he could no longer hide. Marina had given herself away, admitting she knew him, that she believed in his innocence. Now she was completely at the colonel's mercy, all for trying to help. Jedediah slowly rose from his hiding spot and began to walk towards the porch. His hands trembled, but his voice came out firm and clear when he spoke. "Leave her be, Hayes. I'm the one you want." Both turned in his direction. Marina paled at the sight of him, clearly worried for his safety. The colonel, on the other hand, smiled like a predator who had just watched his prey willingly walk into the trap. "Jedediah, what a pleasant surprise." Sarcasm oozed from his every word. "Finally decided to show your face after all this time in hiding." "Marina has nothing to do with this," Jedediah said, ignoring the provocation. "She just wanted to help an injured animal. Let her go." "Oh, but she has everything to do with it." The colonel circled them slowly, like a shark sizing up its prey. "She admitted knowing you, admitted believing you're no thief. That makes her your accomplice." "Accomplice to what?" Marina found her voice again, and there was fury in it now. "To caring for an animal you abandoned injured." accomplice to trespassing, to disturbing the peace, to defying my authority on my own land. Jedediah stepped forward, placing himself between Marina and the colonel. You want to destroy me again? Then destroy me, but leave her out of this. Destroy you. The colonel genuinely laughed now. Jedediah, you destroyed yourself 5 years ago when you decided to steal from me. I merely exposed the truth. What truth? Marina's voice cut through the air like a blade. The truth about your own administrative incompetence. The truth about how you needed a scapegoat for your losses. The silence that followed was absolute. The colonel stared at Marina with eyes that promised retaliation, but she didn't flinch. There was something in the young veterinarian's posture that suggested she knew more than she was revealing. Watch your words, doctor, the colonel said slowly. False accusations can have serious consequences. Then let's talk about false accusations, Marina retorted, pulling an envelope from her pocket. Because I have some very interesting questions about your ranch's accounting in the months leading up to Jedediah's dismissal. Jedediah looked at Marina with surprise and admiration. She had prepared this, had come armed with evidence. It wasn't just an impulsive attempt to help Tempest. It was a planned confrontation. Colonel Sterling Hayes also realized the game had changed. His expression transformed, losing all confident arrogance and gaining something far more dangerous. You two have made a very grave mistake, he said slowly. But don't worry, I'll make sure you both pay for it. As the sun finally disappeared over the horizon, plunging the ranch into darkness, Jedediah understood they had crossed a line of no return. The war had officially begun, and this time there would be no hiding. The sound of an approaching engine interrupted the tension hanging over the porch. Headlights cut through the deepening darkness, and an unknown car pulled up beside Marina's vehicle. Jedediah frowned, trying to identify who could be arriving at that crucial moment. A woman stepped out of the car, and even in the dim light, Jedediah immediately recognized her silhouette. His heart stopped for a moment before wildly thrumming. It was Claire, his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 3 years. Claire was now 28 and carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had always defined their family before disaster struck. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore clothes that spoke of city life. But it was her eyes, her deceased mother's dark eyes, that made Jedediah feel the ground fall away beneath him. "Dad!" Her voice cut the silence like a sharp blade. Colonel Sterling Hayes looked from daughter to father, clearly calculating how this new variable would affect his plans. Marina remained motionless, but Jedediah could see in her expression that she hadn't expected this development. "Claire?" Jedediah could barely utter the name. "What? How did you—" "I received some interesting information about what was happening here." Claire walked slowly towards the group, her eyes moving from her father to the colonel with an expression that mixed determination and hurt. Information that made me question a lot about what happened 5 years ago. She stopped a few feet away, and Jedediah could see she carried a folder of documents. There was something different about Claire, a confidence she hadn't possessed the last time they spoke. It was the stance of someone who had uncovered important truths. "Colonel Sterling Hayes," she said, turning to the rancher. "Do you remember me? I'm Claire Santos, daughter of the man you accused of theft 5 years ago." "Of course I remember," the colonel retorted, but there was caution in his voice now. "And I'm truly sorry for what your father did to our family." "It's interesting you say that," Claire smiled, but there was no warmth in her smile. "Because I've spent the last 2 years investigating exactly what my father did." Jedediah looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and concern. "Claire, you shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "Dangerous?" Claire scoffed. A bitter sound. "Dad, I work as a financial analyst in Chicago. I spend my days investigating accounting fraud and corporate irregularities. When I started receiving anonymous tips about inconsistencies in the Sterling Hayes Ranch's accounting, I decided to do a little private investigation. Colonel Sterling Hayes took a step back, and Jedediah realized the man was genuinely worried for the first time since the conversation began. "Anonymous tips?" Marina asked, intrigued. "Someone sent me copies of old ranch documents, records of purchases, sales, investments made in the years leading up to my father's dismissal." Claire opened her folder and pulled out several papers, documents that show a very clear pattern of financial mismanagement and attempts to cover up losses. "Those are lies!" the colonel exploded. "Forged documents by someone trying to harm me." "Are they lies?" Claire stepped closer to him, extending the papers. "Then can you explain why you invested $200,000 in an ostrich farming project that completely failed? Or why you bought overpriced farm equipment from a company that belongs to your brother-in-law?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jedediah looked from his daughter to the colonel, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what was being revealed. "Or, better yet," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength, "why do the accounting books show that exactly $30,000, the amount my father was accused of stealing, was transferred to a personal account of yours 3 days after his dismissal?" "That's impossible," the colonel murmured, but his voice had lost all authority. "It's impossible because you thought you'd destroyed all the evidence." Claire smiled again, and this time there was triumph in her expression. "I regret to inform you, but banks are required to keep records for 10 years, and I have very good contacts in the financial system." Marina moved closer to Claire, examining the documents with growing interest. "These papers show that the money was embezzled by the colonel himself. Not just that. They show a systematic pattern of embezzlement that lasted at least 2 years before my father's dismissal." Claire turned to Jedediah, and there were tears in her eyes now. "Dad, you were used as a scapegoat to cover up years of corruption and mismanagement." Jedediah felt his legs give way. He leaned against the porch wall, trying to process what he was hearing. He had suspected he'd been wronged, but he had never imagined the extent of the conspiracy against him. "But how," he began to ask, "how did you get these documents?" Claire wiped a tear that streamed down her face. "Because someone who worked here for years decided they couldn't live with the weight of guilt anymore. Someone who watched you be destroyed, knowing the truth." She turned to the colonel, who was now visibly pale. "Your own accountant, Colonel Sebastian Thompson, the man you forced to falsify the documents that incriminated my father. He kept copies of everything all these years, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Sebastian died 2 years ago," the colonel said weakly. "Yes, he died, but before that, he left a full confession and all the evidence with his daughter." Claire smiled, "who happens to be my best friend from college and who decided it was time to get justice." Jedediah's world turned upside down in that moment. Not only was his innocence being proven, but the extent of the betrayal he had suffered was far greater than he had ever imagined. Marina was the first to break the silence that followed. "Colonel Sterling Hayes, I believe you have some explaining to do." But when everyone turned to where he had been standing, they discovered the man had vanished silently into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of his guilt and the weight of 5 years of injustice finally being revealed. The silence that followed the colonel's flight was laden with complex emotions. Father and daughter looked at each other across 5 years of separation, pain, and misunderstanding. Marina, sensing the delicate nature of the moment, discreetly stepped away, allowing the family their privacy. "Claire," Jedediah finally found his voice, but the words came out choked. You believed me all along." Tears streamed freely down the young woman's face now. "No, Dad, and that's the most painful truth of all." She approached slowly, as if fearing he might vanish. "I doubted you. When everything happened, when our lives fell apart, I believed the evidence." The words hit Jedediah like physical blows, but strangely, they brought no anger. There was a brutal honesty in them that he respected. "You were young, Claire. and the evidence seemed very convincing. "That's no excuse." Her voice rose, thick with guilt and regret. "You were my father. I should have trusted you. I should have fought for you. Instead, I moved cities, changed my last name, tried to erase any connection to us." Jedediah felt his heart break and heal at the same time. The pain of his daughter's rejection had been one of the deepest wounds of the past 5 years. But seeing her now, acknowledging her mistake and fighting to correct it, brought a hope he thought he had lost forever. "How did you find out the truth?" he asked, needing to understand how they had come to this moment. Claire wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "It was Carla, Sebastian's daughter. We reconnected at an accounting conference in Chicago last year. When she found out who I was, she was devastated." She paused to take a deep breath before continuing. Her father had carried the guilt for all those years. In the last months of his life, he couldn't sleep, constantly repeating that he had ruined an innocent family. Carla said he even tried to look for you multiple times, but the colonel always threatened him. "Sebastian was always a good man," Jedediah murmured, remembering the shy accountant who worked silently in his small office on the ranch. "I can only imagine the burden he carried." Carla showed me the confession he wrote before he died. Every detail of how the colonel forced him to alter the documents, how they created the false evidence against you, how he was threatened with losing his job if he didn't cooperate. Claire closed her eyes, as if the memories were too painful. "I read that confession about 50 times, trying to accept that for 5 years I had abandoned my own innocent father." Marina approached again, carrying a plastic chair she'd found in the nearby storage shed. "Jedediah, you need to sit down. You've been through a lot of strong emotions today." He gratefully accepted the chair, feeling the weight of years and revelations in his bones. Claire knelt beside him, taking his calloused hands in hers. "Dad, I spent 2 years investigating everything, every transaction, every document, every financial movement of the ranch. I didn't just want to prove your innocence. I wanted to understand exactly how we were deceived. And what did you find? That Colonel Sterling Hayes is a far more sophisticated criminal than we imagined. The fraud he committed wasn't a desperate act. It was an organized system. He embezzled nearly $500,000 over 3 years, always using employees as fall guys." Marina sat on a nearby stone, clearly absorbed by the revelation. $500,000. That's a lot of money. "And it explains why he was so cruel to your father," Claire continued. "Jedediah wasn't just a convenient employee to blame. He was the only one who knew the animals and the operation well enough to potentially uncover his schemes. Understanding hit Jedediah like a wave. That's why he always kept me away from financial meetings in those last few months. He said I should focus only on the animals." "Exactly. He had been preparing your dismissal for months, building the false evidence, getting ready for the moment he needed a scapegoat." The trio fell silent for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of the conspiracy. It was Marina who finally spoke, her voice heavy with indignation. "And Tempest, the horse caught in the fence, was that planned too?" Claire looked at her father with confusion. "What horse?" Jedediah quickly recounted the past few days, about finding Tempest trapped, about his nightly care, about how it had led to this night's confrontation. As he spoke, he watched the anger grow on Claire's face. "He used your compassion against you," she said when he finished. "He knew you wouldn't be able to ignore a suffering animal, especially one you had cared for before. So it really was a trap," Jedediah murmured. "The final trap. He probably planned to use it to incriminate you again, perhaps accuse you of animal theft this time." Claire stood abruptly. "We need to go to that horse now. We need to free him and care for his injuries." "Claire, it's dangerous. The colonel could return any moment." "Let him." The fury in her voice was palpable. "I have enough evidence to destroy his life, just as he destroyed ours. He won't intimidate anyone anymore." Marina stood too, picking up her vet bag. "I'll go with you. Tempest needs immediate medical attention." As they walked together towards the fence, where the horse remained trapped, Jedediah felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for the proof of his innocence, but for the return of his daughter, for the possibility of rebuilding the family he thought he had lost forever. But one question still tormented him. Where was Colonel Sterling Hayes now? And what kind of retaliation would a desperate and exposed man be capable of planning? The answer to that question would come sooner than any of them imagined. The walk to the fence was made in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jedediah led the way, his feet knowing every irregularity of that road even in the darkness. Claire walked beside him, and he noticed that she intently observed his every movement, as if trying to memorize the father she had lost and found again. When they reached the spot where Tempest remained trapped, Marina immediately flicked on a powerful flashlight she'd brought in her bag. The light revealed a sight that made all three of them hold their breath. The horse was visibly weaker than when Jedediah had last seen it. Its head hung low, and it barely stirred at the group's approach. The wounds caused by the barbed wire had worsened, and flies buzzed around the open sores. "My God," Claire murmured, covering her mouth with her hands. How could anyone leave an animal in such a state? Marina was already in action, opening her bag and pulling out medical instruments. "Jedediah, I need you to calm him while I work. He's in shock, and any sudden movement could worsen the situation." Jedediah slowly approached Tempest, extending his hand to gently touch the animal's muzzle. "Hey, old friend, it's time for you to get out of there." To his surprise and relief, Tempest slightly raised its head at the sound of his voice. There was still a gleam of recognition in those dark eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't completely extinguished. "It's incredible," Marina commented, observing the horse's reaction. "Even in a state of extreme exhaustion, he still recognizes you." Claire knelt beside her father, hesitantly extending a hand to touch Tempest's neck. "I remember him," she said softly. "When I was little, you always said he was special, that he had a different soul than other horses. And I was right," Jedediah replied, his hands working to soothe the animal as Marina began to examine the wounds. Tempest was always more than just a horse. It was as if he understood people, as if he could feel their emotions. Marina worked with professional efficiency, carefully cleaning each wound and applying antiseptics. "The cuts are deep, but they haven't hit any major tendons or arteries. With proper care, he'll make a full recovery." "How long will that take?" Claire asked. "A few weeks for complete healing, but first, we need to get him out of here." Marina looked at the complex tangle of barbed wire. "This will require extreme care. One wrong move could cause even worse injuries." Jedediah examined the situation with the experienced eyes of a man who had handled animals his entire life. "I'll need to cut some wires, but I have to do it in a way that doesn't spook Tempest." Claire stood up. "I'll get some tools from the car. I have a pair of pliers in the toolbox." As she walked away, Marina continued her work, speaking softly to Jedediah. "He trusts you completely. That will make the release process much easier." "Marina," Jedediah hesitated before asking his next question, "why did you risk so much to help us? You barely know me, and getting involved in this could ruin your career." She paused her work for a moment, looking directly at him. "Because my father always taught me that there are moments in life when we have to choose between what's convenient and what's right. And because," she smiled slightly, "I've always had a soft spot for lost causes. Lost causes, an innocent man fighting to prove his honesty, an animal suffering for no reason, a daughter trying to reconcile with her father." Marina returned to working on the wounds. "They're all causes worth defending." Claire returned carrying not only the pliers, but also an additional flashlight and some cloths. "I brought more light and cleaning supplies." Together, the three began the delicate process of freeing Tempest. Jedediah carefully cut each strand of wire, always talking softly to the horse to keep him calm. Claire held the flashlights, directing the light exactly where it was needed. Marina constantly monitored the animal's condition, applying more medication as each area was freed. The work took over an hour. Each cut wire revealed new tangles, and it was necessary to stop frequently to ensure Tempest wasn't being injured further. But gradually, the horse regained its freedom of movement. When they finally cut the last wire, Tempest remained motionless for a few moments, as if he couldn't believe he was free. Then, slowly, he tried to take a step. His legs trembled from effort and weakness, but he managed to move. Jedediah supported him, allowing the animal to lean on him as he tested each hoof. "It's working," Claire murmured, tears of relief streaming down her face. Marina performed a final examination, checking each wound and applying bandages where necessary. "He'll need rest and constant care for the next few days. He can't be exposed to the elements." "Where can we take him?" Jedediah asked. It was a practical question, but laden with emotional implications. He had no home, no property, not even a fixed place to sleep. It was Claire who answered, her voice firm and decisive. "Home, Dad, to our place." Jedediah looked at her in confusion. "Claire, I don't have—" "You do now." She smiled, and there was determination in her eyes. "I rented a small farm on the outskirts of town yesterday. It has stables, pasture, everything Tempest will need to recover. You did what? I knew that after today, we'd need a place to start over, all of us." Claire looked from Jedediah to Tempest. A broken family, an injured horse, and a truth that's finally come to light. We have a lot of healing work ahead. As Tempest took his first hesitant steps towards freedom, supported by Jedediah and carefully monitored by Marina, a new reality began to take shape. It wasn't just about proving innocence or exposing someone's guilt. It was about rebuilding lives that had been shattered by injustice. But as they prepared to leave that place of suffering behind, none of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows, planning one last, desperate move to prevent the truth from fully coming to light. Colonel Sterling Hayes was not willing to accept defeat without a final fight. Dawn found Jedediah sitting in a simple wooden chair, watching Tempest rest in the clean stable of the small farm Claire had rented. The horse slept soundly for the first time in days, his wounds properly treated and his body finally relaxed in a safe environment. The property was modest but welcoming, a small two-bedroom house, a well-built stable, and about 5 acres of verdant pasture. It was exactly the kind of place Jedediah had always dreamed of having, but never imagined could be a reality again. Claire appeared at the stable door carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. She had slept only a few hours, but seemed determined to savor every moment with the father she had rediscovered. "How is he?" she asked, offering one of the cups to Jedediah. "Better, much better." Jedediah accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through his calloused hands. Marina did an excellent job. The wounds are clean and the bandages secure. Claire sat on a chair beside him, and for a few minutes they remained in comfortable silence. Father and daughter finally reunited after so many years of separation. "Dad," Claire finally broke the silence, "I need to ask for your forgiveness for much more than just doubting you." Jedediah looked at her, seeing tears form in her eyes. "When everything happened, when our lives fell apart, I was furious. Furious with you for supposedly betraying us. Furious with the world for being unfair. Furious with myself for not being able to keep our family together." Claire wiped away a tear. "But more than that, I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of being poor, scared of losing my status at the university, scared that people would see me as a thief's daughter." Her voice was heavy with shame. "So I ran, I moved cities, changed my last name, built a new life where no one knew our story." Jedediah reached out and gently touched his daughter's arm. "Oh, Claire, you were young. It's natural to be scared when your whole life is turned upside down." "But you didn't run, Dad. Even losing everything, even being humiliated and rejected, you stayed here. You faced the shame, the poverty. People's scorn. Claire looked directly at him. You kept your dignity when I lost mine. Don't say that. You built a career, an independent life. That takes courage too. I built a life based on denying who I really was. For 5 years, whenever anyone asked about my family, I'd make up stories. I'd say my parents had died, that I was an orphan. Claire closed her eyes, as if the memories were too painful. I killed you in my mind because it was easier than facing reality. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allows difficult truths to be absorbed and processed. And what changed? Jedediah asked gently. Onkala showed me a photo of her father in his last days. He was visibly ill, consumed by guilt over what he had done, and she told me something I'll never forget. Guilt is a prison we build ourselves, and only we can find the key to unlock it. Claire stood up and walked to where Tempest rested, watching the animal that symbolized so much suffering and now hope for healing. When I saw that photo, I realized I was in a prison too. A prison made of lies, I told myself, of a new identity built on denying who I really was. She turned to Jedediah, and I realized I could only free myself by facing the truth, even if the truth might confirm your worst suspicions about me. Especially then, because if you truly were guilty, I needed to make peace with that. And if you were innocent, her voice faltered for a moment. And then I had made the biggest mistake of my life by abandoning my own father. Jedediah stood and walked to her, embracing her in a hug they had both waited for 5 long years. Claire collapsed in sobs, releasing years of accumulated guilt, fear, and regret. I missed you so much, Dad, she murmured against his shoulder. Every day, all these years, I missed our talks, your advice, your presence. I missed you too, my daughter. More than you can imagine. They remained embraced for a long time, father and daughter reconnecting through the touch and closeness they had denied themselves for so long. It was the sound of a vehicle approaching that separated them. Claire frowned, looking through the stable window. Are you expecting anyone? Jedediah asked. Marina said she'd come check on Tempest later, but it's still too early. Through the window, they saw a familiar pickup truck pull into the property's driveway. Colonel Sterling Hayes got out of the vehicle, but he wasn't alone. 2 men accompanied him, types Jedediah recognized as hired muscle, the rancher sometimes used for special services. He came all the way here, Claire murmured, her voice a mix of disbelief and fear. Jedediah felt his stomach clench. The colonel had discovered their location, and by the look of grim determination on his face, he hadn't come for a peaceful chat. Claire, you need to call the police, now. But Dad, now. The urgency in his voice made her react immediately. As Claire fumbled for her cell phone, Jedediah watched the colonel and his men approach the house. There was something in the rancher's posture that suggested desperation. A cornered man willing to take extreme measures to protect his secrets. Tempest, as if sensing the tension in the air, raised his head and whinnied softly, a sound that carried both alarm and loyalty to the man who had saved him. The final battle was about to begin, and this time there was nowhere to run. Colonel Sterling Hayes pounded on the house door with excessive force, each thud echoing like a war drum. Jedediah motioned for Claire to stay in the stable while he slowly walked towards the main entrance. Each step was measured, each movement calculated not to provoke an unnecessary escalation of violence. I know you're in there, the colonel's voice pierced through the wooden door. I want to talk to you, civilly. Jedediah opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain in place. What do you want, Hayes? I want my horse back, and I want you to stop this smear campaign against me. What smear campaign? Jedediah opened the door a bit wider, allowing the colonel to see his face clearly. We're just spreading the truth. The truth, the colonel laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is, you trespassed on my property, stole my animal, and now you're using a woman to spread lies about me. The evidence isn't lies, Colonel. They are official documents, bank records, signed confessions. The colonel's face contorted in rage. Documents that can be forged. Confessions that can be invented. The word of a dead accountant against mine. It was at that moment Claire appeared beside her father, her presence immediately altering the dynamic of the situation. She held a thick envelope in her hands, and her eyes shone with cold determination. Actually, Colonel, it's not just the word of a dead accountant. Her voice was firm and professional. It's the word of 3 different banks, 2 independent audits, and the IRS. The colonel visibly paled. What are you talking about? While you were freeing Tempest last night, I spent a few hours making calls to Chicago. I found out I'm not the only person who's been investigating your financial activities. Claire smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. It seems your accounting creativity caught the attention of some authorities. That's impossible. It's possible when you leave a trail of evidence for over 5 years. Suspicious transfers, inconsistent declarations, shell companies. Claire opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. You weren't very careful covering your tracks. Jedediah watched the exchange between his daughter and the man who had destroyed his life. Feeling a mix of pride and concern, Claire had become a formidable woman, capable of facing any adversary with intelligence and courage. But Colonel Sterling Hayes was a desperate man, and desperate men were dangerous. You don't understand who you're messing with, girl, the colonel said, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. I have influence in this county. I have friends in high places. Had, Claire corrected him. But influence built on lies and intimidation tends to crumble when the truth comes to light. It was then the colonel signaled his 2 accompanying men. They approached the door, and Jedediah could see one of them carried a wooden club. Last warning, the colonel said. Give me back my horse and destroy these fake documents, or you'll regret it. Or what? Claire stepped forward, placing herself between her father and the henchman. Are you going to assault us? Are you going to destroy our property? Are you going to threaten us like you did Sebastian for years? If necessary. It was at that moment the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. The colonel looked nervously in the direction of the noise, realizing his window of opportunity was closing fast. Police, Claire said simply. I called them as soon as you arrived. And also some local journalists who might be interested in a story about corruption and abuse of power. The colonel's expression changed from threatening to desperate. You don't know what you're doing. I can make your lives a living hell. Our lives have already been a living hell, Jedediah responded, finally finding his voice. For 5 years, I lived as a pariah, rejected by the community I considered my family. For 5 years, my daughter lived denying her own identity. You've already done the worst you could do to us. And now, Claire continued, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. The sirens were getting closer, and the colonel knew he had no more time. He made one last desperate gesture, trying to push the door open and force his way into the house. But Jedediah was prepared. Years of hard labor had kept his strength, and he managed to keep the door shut until the police cruisers arrived at the property. What followed was a confusion of voices, explanations, and accusations. The police separated everyone involved, while Claire methodically presented all the evidence she had collected. The documents were examined, phone calls were made, and gradually the truth was officially established. Marina arrived in the midst of the confusion, initially worried about Tempest, but quickly understanding the magnitude of what was happening. She joined Jedediah and Claire, offering her testimony about the condition in which she had found the horse and about the threats the colonel had made. When the police finally led Colonel Sterling Hayes away, handcuffed and muttering protests about his innocence, a strange calm descended upon the small farm. The henchmen were also detained, and the threats that had hung over the family finally dissipated. Jedediah looked at Claire, who watched the police cruiser drive away carrying the man who had destroyed their lives. There were tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. "It's finally over." But even knowing that justice was being served, Jedediah felt that the true healing was still just beginning. Recovering his reputation was important, but rebuilding his relationship with Claire and finding his place in the world again would be the real challenge. Tempest whinnied softly from the stable, as if calling them back home. 3 weeks after Colonel Sterling Hayes' arrest, Jedediah stood in the center of the town square, surrounded by more people than he had seen gathered in years. The mayor had convened a public town hall to clarify the facts and restore justice in the community. Pretty words that couldn't erase 5 years of humiliation and rejection. Claire held tightly onto his arm, her presence being the only thing that kept him from fleeing the moment. Marina was on his other side, carrying a folder with all the documents that would publicly prove his innocence. Tempest waited at home, fully recovered and grazing freely in the green pastures of the small farm they now called home. "You don't have to do this, Dad," Claire whispered for the 10th time that morning. "You've already proven your innocence. The authorities have already acknowledged the mistake." "Yes, I do," Jedediah replied, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "These people saw me as a thief for 5 years. They ignored me, rejected me, treated me as if I were invisible. They deserve to hear the truth directly from my mouth." The mayor climbed onto the small makeshift platform and asked for silence. The crowd gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the man who had once been respected and was now about to have his honor publicly restored. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, "we are here today to correct a terrible injustice that has marked our community for the past 5 years." Jedediah observed the faces in the crowd. Some people avoided his gaze, clearly ashamed for having believed the lies. Others stared at him with curiosity, as if seeing a ghost from the past. A few, like Mrs. Gable, smiled encouragingly, showing they had never completely lost faith in him. "Jedediah Santos," the mayor continued, "was unjustly accused of theft 5 years ago. Today, thanks to the investigative work of his daughter Claire and the evidence collected, we know that he was completely innocent." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jedediah knew that many of those people had already heard rumors about his innocence, but hearing the official confirmation was different. "More than that," the mayor raised his voice, "we discovered that Jedediah was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy by Colonel Sterling Hayes to cover up his own financial crimes." The murmur turned into louder chatter. Some people seemed genuinely shocked. Others merely confirmed suspicions they had harbored for years. It was then the mayor called Jedediah to the platform. "I would like to invite Mr. Jedediah Santos to speak with us." Jedediah felt his legs waver. For 5 years, he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to clear his name publicly, to restore his honor before the community that had rejected him. But now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to have completely fled his mind. Claire squeezed his arm encouragingly. "Go, Dad. Tell them who you really are." Jedediah walked slowly to the platform, feeling every gaze fixed on him. When he reached the microphone, he looked at the crowd and saw faces he had known since childhood, merchants with whom he had done business, neighbors who had been friends, people who once respected him and then scorned him. "I don't quite know what to say," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And for 5 years, I carried the weight of a false accusation. For 5 years, I walked these streets being treated like a criminal." The silence was absolute now. Every person in the square was completely focused on his words. "There were times when I almost believed that maybe I really was guilty of something, times when the pain of rejection was so great that I wondered if it wouldn't be easier to just admit to crimes I never committed." He paused, searching for strength to continue. "But there was something that kept me from giving up completely, the memory of who I was before all this happened. the memory of the man who cared for animals with love, who worked honestly to support his family, who believed that doing the right thing was always the best choice. Tears began to stream down the faces of some people in the crowd. Jedediah saw Mrs. Gable wiping her eyes with a tissue, and the baker who used to give him stale bread bowing his head in shame. "Today I'm not here to blame anyone," Jedediah continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not here to apologize for what you did or failed to do. I'm here to say one simple thing. I was always innocent, and I will always be the same man you knew before." He looked directly at Claire, who smiled through her tears. "I'm here to say that suffering taught me things prosperity never could. It taught me the importance of compassion, the value of self-dignity, and the power of never giving up on the truth." The crowd was completely silent now, many people openly weeping. "And I'm here to say that I forgive. I forgive everyone who doubted me, who turned their backs on me, who believed lies about my character, because holding a grudge would be to turn myself into the kind of person I never was." When Jedediah descended from the platform, an extraordinary thing happened. One person in the crowd began to applaud, then another and another. In a few moments, the entire square was on its feet, applauding the man who had maintained his dignity even in the darkest moments. But what touched Jedediah's heart most deeply weren't the applause. It was seeing Claire running towards him, tears of pride streaming down her face, ready to embrace the father who had not only survived injustice, but emerged from it a man of even greater integrity. In that moment, under the warm sun of the square, where he had been publicly humiliated years ago, Jedediah Santos finally recovered not only his reputation, but something even more precious, the certainty that he had remained true to himself when everything around him had crumbled. The truth had triumphed, but more importantly, his soul had remained intact. 6 months after the town hall, Jedediah stood on the porch of his home, watching Tempest gallop freely across the green pasture. The horse had fully recovered, not just physically, but emotionally as well. His white coat shone in the sun, and there was a joy in his movements that hadn't been seen in a long time. The small farm had completely transformed since they moved there. Claire had used part of the financial compensation they received from the lawsuit against Colonel Sterling Hayes to make improvements to the property. Now there were new fences, a modern irrigation system, and even a small vegetable patch where Jedediah grew produce for his own consumption. "Dad?" Claire's voice drew him from his thoughts. She approached carrying 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had established for Sunday mornings. "I was just thinking," Jedediah said. Accepting the coffee and sitting in a rocking chair Claire had bought especially for him, about how everything changed. "For the better?" Claire asked, sitting beside him. "Definitely for the better, but not in the way I expected." Claire looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jedediah pointed to Tempest, who had stopped running and was now grazing peacefully. "When all this started, I thought it would be about saving a horse. Then I thought it would be about proving my innocence. But ultimately, it was about so much more than that. It was about what? It was about discovering that even when we lose everything, home, work, reputation, family, we can still find purpose in helping another suffering being." Jedediah smiled, watching the animal that had catalyzed his entire journey of redemption. And it was about learning that sometimes, by saving others, we end up saving ourselves. Marina appeared at the property entrance, walking towards the house with her vet bag. Even with Tempest fully recovered, she continued to make regular visits, no longer as a veterinarian, but as a family friend. "How's our favorite patient today?" she asked, joining them on the porch. "Perfect," Jedediah replied. Sometimes I look at him and can barely believe he's the same animal I found caught in that fence." Marina sat on the edge of the porch, observing Tempest with professional satisfaction. "Animals' capacity for recovery always impresses me. They don't hold grudges. They don't live in the past. When they're treated with love and care, they simply flourish. Like people should be." Claire murmured. Like people can be, Jedediah corrected. Since the town hall, I've had visits from people who want to apologize for what happened. Just yesterday, the baker showed up offering fresh bread every week. Mrs. Gable brought a cake and stayed for 2 hours talking about old times. And how do you feel about that? Marina asked. Jedediah reflected for a moment before answering. Grateful, not because they apologized, but because they had the courage to admit they were wrong. It shows that our community still has kindness in its heart. Claire gently touched her father's arm. Dad, I received an interesting call last night. From whom? From Mr. Davis, owner of Hope Ranch. He heard about your experience with horses and wants to offer you a job, not as a regular employee, but as a specialized consultant in equine behavior. Jedediah raised his eyebrows, surprised. A consultant? It seems your story with Tempest spread throughout the county. Several breeders were impressed with your ability to connect with a traumatized animal and help him recover. Claire smiled. They want to learn your methods. The irony of the situation was not lost on Jedediah. 5 years ago, he had been run off a ranch under false accusations. Now, he was being invited to share his expertise with other breeders. And what did you say? That I'd talk to you first. But Dad, it would be an incredible opportunity. You could work with what you love, help other animals, and still build a reputation based on your true competence. Marina applauded the idea. It would be perfect, Jedediah. You have a natural gift with animals, especially those who have experienced trauma. Perhaps, Jedediah said thoughtfully. But first, I want to make sure Tempest is completely stable here. He's been through a lot, and I don't want him to feel abandoned again. As if he had heard his name, Tempest raised his head and looked directly at the group on the porch. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to trot towards the house. Look at that, Marina whispered. He wants to be part of the conversation. Tempest approached the porch and stretched his neck over the low fence, clearly seeking affection. Jedediah stood and went to him, gently stroking the soft muzzle. What do you think, old friend? He asked the horse. Should we help other horses like we helped you? Tempest leaned his head on Jedediah's shoulder, a gesture of affection and trust that made Claire and Marina smile. I think he approves of the idea, Claire said. Jedediah continued stroking Tempest, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of all the animals that might be suffering as Tempest had suffered, of all the owners who could learn more compassionate training methods, of all the lives, human and animal, that could be improved through what he had learned on his journey. You know what? He said finally. I think I'll accept that offer, but on one condition. What? Claire asked. I want you to be my partner in the business. You have a business background. You know the legal aspects. You can help structure everything properly. Claire was silent for a moment, clearly moved by the proposal. Dad, I'd love to work with you, but I have my job in Chicago. What if you could do both? Work remotely part-time, come here on weekends and holidays? Jedediah smiled. It's not just about the business, Claire. It's about us having time to rebuild our relationship, to make up for the years we lost. Tears glistened in Claire's eyes. You'd really like that? More than anything in the world. Tempest whinnied softly, as if giving his approval to the plan. Marina laughed, watching the scene with affection. Looks like you have the blessing of the most important family member, she said, as the sun set over the small farm, painting the sky in golden and rose hues. Jedediah felt a deep peace settle in his heart. His journey of suffering had ended, but a new journey of purpose and connection was just beginning. He had lost everything once, but now he was gaining something even more valuable, the chance to transform his pain into healing, his experience into wisdom, and his compassion into strength to help others. A year later, Jedediah stood in the same spot where he had found Tempest caught in the barbed wire fence. But now, instead of an injured and desperate animal, there was just a green, peaceful field where some wildflowers had bloomed. The fence had been removed and replaced by a low wooden fence that posed no danger to any creature. Claire was by his side, holding a small plaque that would be installed there in memory of all animals who had suffered unnecessarily. The idea had been hers, to transform that place of pain into a symbol of hope and renewal. "Dad," she said, watching the flowers dance gently in the morning breeze, "do you regret anything?" Jedediah reflected on the question his daughter frequently asked, as if she still needed reassurance that they had made the right decisions. Having suffered, no. His answer surprised Claire, as it always did. "Suffering taught me who I really am. It taught me that I can lose everything and still keep my humanity intact. And losing 5 years with us? Those years weren't lost, my daughter. They were invested in making us the people we needed to be here today." Jedediah smiled, watching Tempest grazing peacefully a few yards away. "If none of this had happened, you would still be a young woman who defined her worth by what others thought of her. I would still be a man who had never truly tested his own strength." Claire nodded, comprehending the wisdom of her father's words. In recent months, she had left her job in Chicago and moved permanently to the farm. Together, they had created a rehabilitation center for traumatized horses that was gaining recognition throughout the county. "And Marina?" Claire asked, smiling as she saw the veterinarian approach carrying her bag and accompanied by a young couple bringing a visibly frightened horse. "Marina found her true calling," Jedediah replied. "She was always an excellent vet, but now she's also a healer of souls, both human and animal." They watched Marina talk gently with the couple, explaining the rehabilitation process their horse would undergo. There was a serenity in her posture that hadn't existed before, the satisfaction of someone who had found their true purpose in life. "And the Colonel?" Claire rarely asked about him, but today seemed to be a day to close all circles of the past. "The Colonel is paying for his choices, not just legally, but living with the burden of knowing that he destroyed lives out of greed and pride." Jedediah paused. "Sometimes I think my prison was more liberating than his." "What do you mean?" "My prison was external. Poverty, rejection, humiliation. But inside, I remained free. His prison is internal. Guilt, bitterness, loneliness. And that kind of prison has no keys that others can turn." Tempest raised his head and began to walk towards them, as he did every morning. It was a daily ritual. The horse sought Jedediah for affection and, in a way, offered his own kind of silent gratitude. "Hello, old friend," Jedediah murmured, stroking the animal's soft neck. "Ready for another day of work?" Tempest had become an integral part of the rehabilitation center. His calm and confident presence helped other traumatized horses feel safe. It was as if he understood that his own healing gave him the responsibility to help others find theirs. Claire carefully installed the plaque on the new post. The words she had chosen were simple but powerful. "In memory of all creatures who have suffered, and in celebration of the infinite capacity for healing and renewal that exists in every heart that opens to love." "Perfect," Jedediah said, reading the words aloud. Your mother would be proud of you." "She'd be proud of both of us," Claire corrected, "of how we transformed pain into purpose, trauma into healing, separation into unity." Marina approached them after settling the new horse in the quarantine stable. "How's our patient number 50? "Frightened, but with potential," Jedediah replied. "I'll start working with him tomorrow. Tempest can help. He has a special way with newcomers." "You know our waiting list now has over 100 cases," Marina said, but there was pride in her voice, not concern. 100 families willing to invest in healing instead of giving up on their animals," Claire observed. "That shows our message is spreading." "Our message is simple," Jedediah said, looking around the property that had become much more than a house. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing, a living testament to the power of compassion. No matter how deep the wounds, no matter how lost hope may seem, there is always a way back to the light. The sun was high now, warming the earth and making the flowers shine with vibrant colors. Jedediah looked at his daughter, at his dear friend Marina, at Tempest grazing peacefully at the rehabilitation center they had built together, and felt a deep gratitude fill his heart. He had started this journey as a solitary drifter walking a dusty road. He was ending it as a man surrounded by love, purpose, and hope, not just for himself, but for all those his story would touch. "You know what?" he said, putting his arms around Claire and Marina. "I used to think the opposite of suffering was happiness, but now I know that the opposite of suffering is purpose. And when we find our purpose, happiness becomes a natural consequence." Tempest whinnied softly, as if agreeing with that philosophy, and as the three friends walked back home, followed by the horse that had catalyzed this whole transformation, the future stretched ahead of them, bright with infinite possibilities, because some stories don't end, they simply transform into new beginnings, echoing through time as reminders that hope, once planted in the fertile ground of compassion, always finds a way to flourish.